Today's model really is, if I'm going to implement a new technology, I'm going to look for the right technology partner who's going to stay with me the entire process from start to finish, both in understanding what's the challenge we're trying to solve, how is that technical solution or technology going to solve that challenge, and how do we implement it. And there needs to be inherent to the corporate culture that if it doesn't succeed, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can learn just as much from a fail as you can a success. Just because you have the endless saga capability doesn't mean that you should take all the products away and make them 100% digital in that physical environment. If I introduce one of these new things, is that going to bring in a new type of customer that I otherwise wasn't getting? So that's really the significance of these low-code technology. It empowers the business users at the retailer to build their own tools without having to wait for IT staff to build things for them.
But before we begin, a quick shout out to our partner, ImShop. This company creates the best out-of-the-box mobile app solution for retail and e-commerce. They are cost-effective, fast-start omni-channel solution with open integrations. I worked with them and I can assure the quality. imshop.io. The link will be in the description below. So now back to the interview. Hi, Ricardo.
Hi, Philip. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for finding time for us and welcome to the Digital Voice podcast.
Thanks very much.
For the viewers and listeners who don't know you accidentally, can you do a brief introduction about who you are and know what you're doing?
Yeah, happy to. So, Ricardo Belmar, many people know me as a retail industry influencer. I've been on a couple of top lists. I think RIS News named me a top influencer for 2021, and I've been in Rethink Retail's top 100 influencer list as well. My day job, if you will, so to speak, is I work for Microsoft as the lead partner marketing advisor for retail and consumer goods, which is kind of a long-winded way of saying that I get to work quite a bit with the Microsoft Partner Network with partners that are targeting retail and consumer goods brands. And I help them with their go-to-market and in co-selling with Microsoft as they build their solutions on Microsoft technology. And then in addition to that, I'm also a host of a podcast called The Retail Razor. That's also a room on Clubhouse that's currently on break with the team that does that with me. We took a holiday break, but we'll be coming back soon with new sessions there. And basically, I have been in some form or fashion working with the retail industry as a technology provider for, I would say, the better part of the last 2 decades. Both primarily retailers in North America, but also across Europe as well.
Retail is one of those industries that keeps us wondering when the disruption will come. And, I'm working in retail for quite a long time, and every year we're seeing and hearing that the disruption will come, and e-commerce, Amazon, omnichannel, now COVID, pandemic will kill the retail as we know it, and something new will emerge. But years are passing, and we still see that the retail is standing strong. But there are many challenges, like the COVID pandemic, and like of course the Amazons of the world, and other threats from outside are challenging the industry. So if we use our binoculars of potential risk for the industry for the year to come, for this new year, what would be the top risks for the retail industry as you see?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few. I think you're absolutely right that this is for whatever reason, right? People outside the industry, I think, love to say that retail is in crisis, right, or that we're having some sort of retail apocalypse, either because so many countries experience a rash of store closings, or there's always the perpetual notion that e-commerce is just going to completely take over retail and that no one will ever shop in stores again. And of course, none of these things ever actually happen. They're all exaggerations to a certain degree. And even in the pandemic, when it started, I think we really heard a lot of messaging out there that as consumers shifted online, when stores were forced to close, because of lockdowns and so forth, that was just a fundamental shift and that there was no turning back. And of course, here we are 2 years later. And while that's still a challenge, right, in some parts of the world, there's obviously still very much a COVID challenge for retail. And I'll say a few more things about that in a minute, but the idea that e-commerce was going to completely take over just didn't happen. Yes, it experienced growth. Yes, it was accelerated. But we still see, by and large, in most parts of the world, about 80 to 85% of retail sales are still happening in stores. Now, will that change? Could e-commerce grow to be 20, 25%? I'd say it's possible. It certainly could happen in a number of places, but I don't think that's necessarily the challenge to be focused on. I think the better retailers have realized that they just need to look at that as one of many sales channels, and that the impact of that is that their customers are not going to stay within that sales channel. They're going to move back and forth across channels, whether it's digital form, whether it's mobile, whether online or social commerce, or whether it's in-store. And ultimately, every transaction is going to involve a combination of all of these interaction points with customers. So what does that mean for the retailer, right? What's the challenge for them? Well, they've got to be prepared. I would argue in a couple of different ways. One is in terms of resilience and agility in their speed at which they can adapt to these things. So I think that there's one lesson that COVID has taught retailers is that you can't live in a world where it takes you 6 months to implement a new project that has an impact on customer experience. And now we've learned that, 6 months can actually be done in 6 weeks, and in some cases, 6 days. There's finally a motivation, right, for retailers to realize that tech isn't this slow-moving thing. It's something that you need to use quickly and be agile with. And whether that impacts, store experience, whether it's somewhere in the supply chain, whether it's last mile logistics, the key is being able to act quickly. So that's one big challenge I think retailers have, is how do they structure themselves in order to support that resiliency and that agility. Another big challenge, particularly I'd say that the last year, labor shortages. I think this is affecting retailers in many countries, right, where they just can't find enough staff, whether it's frontline workers in stores, whether it's in warehouses, or frankly, even at corporate, where they're trying to fill new positions. And it's a fundamental change, I think, that has happened, obviously not just in the retail industry, but that the workforce in general. People have realized, the job I have doesn't have to be the only job I can get. I can find other jobs. And if I don't like the job I have, I can probably find another one. Which means, of course, that now that the power has kind of shifted from employer to employees, and retailers are going to have to deal with that and accept the fact that they're not the one necessarily dictating. In the U.S., for example, there was, in the last few months, there's been a rash of announcements from retailers over the past year or so where they keep adding more enticements. And of course, it's not just about wages. It's not just about compensation. It's other areas and benefits that matter to the workforce, and that retailers have to start competing with each other now to find the workforce they want. And I would even argue that if you look at this at a corporate level, as things like the impact of data becomes more important, retailers need to hire people and train people that know what to do with that data and be able to act on it and make it actionable. But guess what, right? They're not the only industry doing that, right? Other industries also want that very same specialized skill set. And that means that it's not going to come cheap. And retailers have to realize they're going to have to adjust both compensation, but how they treat those employees across the board to really remain competitive. So those are, I think, a couple major areas. I would say maybe coming back to the data piece, COVID also, I think, taught a lesson for retailers that your ability to use the data you have and react quickly with it can actually give you pretty strong competitive advantages versus retailers that have this data, but they just don't know what to do with it. And whether it's as simple as using that data to understand why your customers are shopping with you, why they're loyal, or just in basic fundamentals like forecasting and merchandising, there's a lot to be gained from the data that retailers already have, and building appropriate customer data platforms and things of that sort that really help them analyze that data and be more predictive. But doing that quickly is obviously pretty important now.
It's very interesting because you began with saying that retail is this multiple amount of channels nowadays. So this is social commerce, this is e-commerce, this is your brick and mortar. Everything together gives you the retail. So the Jack Ma has saying that there is no retail. There is this new one
Mm-hmm.
retail, which includes everything.
Right.
So I guess when we're saying like retail against e-commerce, Amazon against retail, it's less and less about the retail being just this chain of brick and mortar stores, right?
Right.
So it's more and more about how you sell, and you need to use all of the channels.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it really is about
Is there still a
exactly
retail?
right.
So
At,
I
at the end of
guess
the day, I like to say it's all just commerce, right? It's not about the channels
yeah,
because I think one of the revelations has been for retailers that retailers have always thought in terms of sales channels. How is this channel performing against this other channel? How is this store comping against this other store and year over year? But how do consumers and their customers think about it? Customers don't think about channels, right? Customers see one brand, it's where they shop, and they may choose to shop at that brand 5 different ways. But to the customer, it makes no difference. Their expectation is that no matter which way I choose as the customer to shop with you, it's going to work, and it's going to work seamlessly and easily and convenient so that I keep shopping with you. And I think that's what's really making the difference. So of course, they're specialists, right? So you think of the Amazons of the world who are clearly experts at online and e-commerce, but are they equally adept at brick and mortar retailer? You can make some pros and cons arguments there about whether it's still a learning environment for Amazon in particular. But in some ways, they get some things right, they might get some other things wrong. But again, that goes back to another point I said, that it's about the agility and quickness and speed at which you can adapt. So, you have to be willing to experiment across these channels and realize that if I've done something that's not working in one channel, it doesn't mean the channel is bad. It means that I need to do something different to make that channel successful.
sure, sure. So the other thing, very interesting thing you said is about the implementation of data in your business. And I guess if you look at this broader than implementation of new technologies, because they're coming up every year. I guess even every couple of
Mhm.
months. For sure, every single conference that we are going in, we see and hear about some new fantastic technology that will allow you to implement your data set to gain new sales or to increase retention rates and stuff like this. And there are some retailers and some companies that are jumping on those technologies for the sake of the
Mhm.
technology. And do you think that this in itself represents some sort of a challenge, how to actually filter this and how to actually approach those technologies and to look at them correctly?
Yeah, there's definitely a challenge there. I'm always saying to retailers, implementing technology just for the sake of the technology is not going to be a successful strategy, right? There has to be a purpose, and that purpose has to deliver something tangible in terms of either a good ROI, or it's got to impact an important metric or KPI for the business, whether it's something like conversion rate or average order value or lifetime customer value, or even if it's just something that makes decision making process faster, right? More flexible, more resilient. Those are some relatively tangible things that have to be spelled out as an objective that tells you why you're chasing this technology. It's not about everybody else is using this technology, so I have to have it. Sometimes there are technologies where a retailer might say, well, it seems clear if I look around me that customers may want to see us using this technology. That's a fair statement. I think then the challenge becomes, well, how do I do it? Right? It's not, especially when we're talking about technology in the store, you have to really look at, well, how is it going to be used? How is it going to impact the overall shopping journey once a customer is in that store? How is my store associates going to be impacted by this technology? Do they have any feedback on how it should be done, whether it should be done differently? And all of these things need to really be looked at to make sure that there's going to be a positive impact from using that technology for the business. And I know I keep coming back to saying that speed is important now, right? This is one of the top lessons through COVID is that it can't take you 6 months to figure these things out.
Yeah, and so usually the implementation of like those technological solution might be a very long and
Mm-hmm.
painful process for some bigger companies, and implementation of the technology might come out not as a solution for their strategy or for some major problem, but more of a as a patch, so
Mm-hmm.
to speak. It takes you months to implement it, sometimes even years for the bigger systems like the ERP systems, but it doesn't solve some of your problems for the long term strategy of the business. So I guess the question is how to correctly approach the implementation of the technology and to make it more agile, not to spend half a year on implementation of this technology and only to find out that this was not the solution and we need to move on to some other technology now.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. I think an important factor here, it comes in choosing the right technology partner. In the past, you could say that many retailers felt that when they work with a vendor, they saw them as a supplier, much as they would see a merchandise supplier, and they expected to be delivered a technology and then they would just handle it. I think that model is really outdated now, and it's not really the model that a successful retailer follows. Today's model really is, if I'm going to implement a new technology, I'm going to look for the right technology partner who's going to stay with me the entire process from start to finish, both in understanding what's the challenge we're trying to solve, how is that technical solution or technology going to solve that challenge, and how do we implement it. And then I think another piece there as well is, when you say implementation, if we're talking about store technology, for example, it's not just implementation at a store, it's an implementation at all stores in the chain. And that carries other implications, right, when it comes to scaling and not every store is the same as every other store, so there might be variables. But the key really is having a technology partner that you trust and one that will work with you all the way through the process to the end. And frankly, even once it's deployed, the relationship doesn't end there, right? The relationship continues with that technology partner, because as the retailer, you would hope that that partner is going to keep coming back to you and saying, good news, we've enhanced something. We have a new functionality that's going to make what we did even better. And you keep iterating and working with that partner, and it becomes a long-term relationship for success. And that's really how successful retailers are going to view that relationship. I think then another factor that you can't overlook is the corporate culture of the retailer. And this is, I think, particularly a challenge for legacy retailers and certainly larger ones, because over the years, right, they've built a lot of organizational structure. It's inherently created silos in the organization. People are used to doing things a certain way. They're not used to crossing those boundaries in those silos and working with other teams. So that it's absolutely true that culture eats strategy for breakfast, as they say, right? It's especially in retail, and that culture starts with the executive team and works its way all the way down the organization. When you do a deployment of a new technology, you have to have buy-in at every level. And again, if I look at when it's a store level technology, oftentimes retailers overlook the impact of the store teams themselves. And those people have feedback on whatever that technology, whatever the solution is. They will have feedback that could be positive, it could be negative, but the implementation team needs to have their buy-in from the beginning and really understand what that feedback is, because that's going to determine how successful it is. And I have so many examples of retailers I've worked with over the years where that part was neglected. So when it came time to put the technology in the store, they had a lot of store teams that were kind of scratching their heads saying, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I'm not really sure why this makes my life better, so why should I use it? And then the adoption rate is low, especially if it's technology that you're assuming your store associates are going to use to make them more productive or to better serve customers. But if the adoption isn't there, then you've done a lot of work for nothing. So you really have to get all of that buy-in up front, and that really speaks to the corporate culture.
Well, considering your great experience in this field and the amount of projects that you probably seen already, it's very interesting to get your practical, because we want to bring as much value as we can to our listeners and viewers. So if there are guys and girls who are working in the companies right now in different positions and they're looking to implement something, and I guess that years to come for the retailers, e-commerce, digital companies, it's always years of implementation of some sort. So you're always in some sort of implementation. You said something very interesting, but at the same moment very confusing about how we can use the partner and how we need to make sure that this partner will stay with us. Because I think that the first thought that will come to the minds of our listeners is, okay, yeah, these partners are working hourly, so for sure they would want to stay for us for a long time, because for the longer they work on this solution, the more that they're getting from us. So how to find balance here? Because, as a commercial company, we need to look at our commercial interests, and we need them
Mhm.
fast. So we need them as soon as possible. How to maybe KPI the partner, if that is even
Mhm.
possible. Maybe you've seen some examples of that. So you will have this level, this level of agility, and at the same moment, their real investment into the result, not into spending more and more hours on the project.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And what I would say is that it is of course important up front to define what success is, and part of defining that success is that you have an expectation of what a start and a finish is. For a given project. So that's true, right? If you are working with a system integrator, right, you probably are paying essentially by the hour, right? You're paying for time for getting that help. So you do want to have a definable finish to it. What I think really matters in how the retailer chooses which integrator, for example, to work with. Some criteria that should enter that decision is, do I trust the team of people I'm engaged with? Because once that project reaches that finish line, and the definable cost part of it ends, what's my expectation as a retailer? Is that integrator going to then walk away, and until I come back to them as the retailer and say, I have a new challenge, am I never going to hear from them again? Or do I expect that I'm working with an account team that understands how to build a relationship with the customer, and then they're going to come back, and even though we're not engaged in a billable project, they're going to come back to me and say, we'd like to talk to you about some new things that we think might help you, and then kind of have sort of this exploration of what's possible that they might be able to help with. And a good integrator, a good vendor is going to know that that doesn't mean 100% of the time that you engage that way, you're going to make a sale. Even if it's 50% of the time, that with the 50% that didn't result in a project, you still improve the relationship, and it enhances the odds that the next time you work with that customer, you might get an engagement out of it. So I think that the best integrator that you can work with is going to have that approach, and that's who a retailer wants to seek out. Then if there's just a pure technology provider involved, where maybe the cost model isn't so much in terms of time, it might be more based on a cloud service, right? So you have recurring subscription costs, right? In that case, right, then you still also are going to have some level of an account type of relationship, whether it's with a sales team or a customer success team. But with most providers, and let's also consider if it's a startup technology, because the startup is even more incentivized, right, to maintain this relationship, because they need you, the retailer, to be a good reference for them so they can get their next win. If you're not, referenceable for them, then from the startup's perspective, that was a failed project, because they're not going to be able to leverage, the fact that they completed that in any way to get more sales. So there's good reasons, in that sense, for why retailer might want to work with startups, or why they might want to work with a long-standing tech provider. But I think being able to evaluate how is the relationship going to work long term should be considered when you make that choice. It's not just about the technology, but it's also about who are you getting the technology from, who's helping you with that implementation. So I think those factors need to be understood by the retailer when they make that choice, and I think that goes a long way towards impacting that aspect.
Do you think that this is a good idea to ask the sales team from this partner to actually have a meeting with the, I don't know, business analytics, or the guys whom you will be working with lately? I'm not sure if all of them will be
Mhm.
willing to do this, right? But is it a good idea to ask for that prior to actually getting into this marriage with them?
Yeah. So if I'm the retailer, I think the way I would look at this is, you should feel able to ask for any of these kind of discussions, right? So you want to know who's specifically going to be involved in the project, because of course it's not the sales team's not going to be the one helping you implement, right? The sales team's job is to make you comfortable with, selecting them, right, for the project. So you do want to make sure that, ask if you can talk to the implementation team. Now, of course, if you do that, you should expect then for the vendor to come back to you and say, well, likewise, we'd like to understand who on your side is going to be involved in the project, right? Because the people making the buy decision aren't necessarily the ones who are going to be involved in the day-to-day implementation either. So it does go both ways. And I think the projects that end up working the best and resulting in a win are the ones where that level of engagement happens between the retailer and the tech partner. If there's a third integrator involved, all parties concerned, they engage and interact in that manner. And that's why the project ends up being successful. If you just treat it as a transaction, right, with the sales team, then it's not as likely to be as successful. And then when you do run into problems, because let's face it, all projects eventually run into a problem. They don't, nothing ever works perfectly the first time, and that's okay. But you have to know, well, who am I going to, right, to solve the problems that come up, and you have to trust that team. So I think that's an important factor there as well. One other thing that I also bring up in this regard with retailers is oftentimes retailers have in mind that if I'm putting a new project, and again, I like using store technology as an example for this, they have a set of test stores that they're always used to working with, because they know that in their minds, right, the people at that store, they love working with new technology. They're going to kick things around and find all the problems and really help us out. Well, my experience has been that retailers that treat it that way, every proof of concept is a success, because that store team, right, is self-motivated to make it successful. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that's not representative of all of your other store locations. So you've kind of enhanced your ability to succeed up front at the expense of understanding how you're going to scale it out to go throughout all of your locations. So my recommendation usually there is you have to have a mix, right? Sure, you want to have one or two friendly, well understood and known test stores that can work well with this, but you do need to have at least one that's not like that, because they're the ones who are going to give you all the surprises and say, oh, well, we didn't think of that. Wow, how did this happen? And that's how you're going to overcome those challenges.
Well, that's very interesting. You said actually after that it comes to an internal culture of the company so that the project will be implemented successfully. And that makes a lot of sense, because if the culture inside of the company is not very active and people are not very motivated, so probably this will not end up in a success story. How do you... So, okay, we found the partner and we think that they will be the ones, but then we end up with, putting together the team, the internal team that will work with them and to actually motivate them. What are the tips that you can give on how to put this team together inside of the retailer and to keep them motivated for the long period of time, even with the failures, even if with something going wrong, but to keep the team being motivated and actually bringing the process to the success?
Yeah, there's a few things there. So one is, every project has sort of this inherent motivation that the business wants the project to succeed. But like you said, at the end of the day, you're putting together a specific team that's going to deliver that project. So what's the personal motivation for them? I think a good retail business here understands that they need to have some sort of motivation for the individuals in that team so that they understand, there are two possibilities here. It's going to succeed and it might not. And there needs to be inherent to the corporate culture that if it doesn't succeed, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can learn just as much from a fail as you can a success. And oftentimes, right, you learn more from the failed attempt because it teaches you that there's something you either hadn't thought about, overlooked, or maybe didn't realize in understanding what the challenge was, that now you have to go find a different solution to address it. So oftentimes where I see these projects fail overall is because the team believes that if that project fails, it's somehow going to look badly on them. And it's going to mean something at a personal level. Oh, this is bad for me inside the company because the project failed. So I have to make it succeed. But so what does that really say? That means that when you start the project, when you define what success is, one of the definitions there needs to be defined. Well, what happens if it doesn't work? How do we turn that around and learn from it so we don't just walk away from a failure? Because that's not the right answer, right? If it doesn't work, you need to know why so that you can make a change. And then maybe that means you start the project again with something new. Now, another point you brought up before as well, right, is that if you're trying to do this quickly now, that's also important. So these are all things that you have to define up front when you're looking at the project and saying, how do we know what success looks like? What are we trying to is there something we can measure? It doesn't necessarily mean there always will be, and that's okay, as long as you understand what am I trying to do when I get to the finish line here, and how do I know that that's a success or a failure? And again, if it is a failure, we need to learn from it. And frankly, the best retailer is going to say, if it's going to fail, we want to know that faster, right? Not if we're 3 weeks into what we thought was a 6-week project and it's looking like it's going to fail, we need to be okay with saying to ourselves, you know what, we got to stop right here. Let's figure out why this is a fail and shift gears. If we need to do something else and then keep going. So there's some fundamental differences there, right, in culture. We don't just try to force something to happen because we're afraid of what that fail might look like. So that's, I think, is a key cultural importance that has to happen within any successful team. And that speaks to the individual motivations for the people you put on the team, right? They want to know that they're going to get something out of this project. No one really wants to be right on a team that says, it's just something to do. It's a task. That results in, going back to the point about labor shortages earlier, right? That's what leads to people saying, maybe this isn't the right job for me and I want to find something else. And that's not what the business wants to happen.
So on the other hand, after that, so let's assume that we have the partner, we have the structured team, we have the internal culture that is bringing us to the success. Now we need a pilot. Mm-hmm. And as you said already, it's not a very probably good idea to do the pilot in the store that you actually know the pilot will work in, because
what are you going to learn then?
Yeah. What's the point then? If we're speaking about some technologies like endless aisle, this is a technology that we heard about for a long time already, and like digital signage, endless aisle technology, pick-up boxes technology like the Nike has in their New York flagship store. And a lot of retailers and a lot of stores are looking at this and saying, well, it looks like we can actually implement this. It looks like we can actually try this. How do they approach it? Because if they have, I don't know, from a retailer that has a couple of stores up to the retailer that has a couple of hundred stores, how do they choose? What number of stores do they choose? And how do they run this test to see the most reliable results, actually?
Yeah, it can be tricky, right? So if you think about, a retailer with 100 stores is going to come to a different decision than a retailer with 5 stores when it comes to this. So that 5-store retailer, is probably okay with saying, I'm going to pick one store to try this out, see what happens, and if that works, I'll move to the next store. So inherently, because of their smaller scale, right, they have sort of a luxury in the ability to say, I can do it one at a time. If I'm the 100-store retailer, I probably don't want to assume my implementation is going to be one store at a time, because then it might take me 18 months to get through all 100 stores. So I'm more likely to say, I'm going to test this at 5 locations. So which 5 do I pick? Now, so like we said before, I think my recommendation would be, well, you can pick 2 that you're comfortable with, that are used to testing new things, but try to pick the others as ones that are not like that. And try to pick ones that are not cookie cutter similar to each other, because that variability is going to show you the differences in how you're going to scale from those 5 to 100. I think that this notion of how I scale a technology solution is one that I've seen trip up retailers so many times, because they get the specific IT teams that are used to those large scale implementations involved too late in the process. So the core project team believes that, well, we successfully completed the test at the 5-store pilot, so now we know everything we need to know to do the other 95. And almost always it turns out there's something they don't know. And it's not because they did something wrong, it's because they just simply didn't know what to ask to understand why it might be different at those other 95 stores. A common example I've found is, let's say it's, you mentioned digital signage, and that was always a good example, because where did so many digital signage projects in past years fail? It was in content, right? There wasn't enough content to sustain the freshness of what was going on that screen. Well, how do you get content to a screen at a store? You got to have a network, right, to send that data across, to send that content. So oftentimes retailers that did that didn't realize that the network quality and the amount of bandwidth they had, for example, at different stores varied so much. When they made the content appear on those screens at the 5 test stores, it was easy. But when they got to store number 57, suddenly they say, oh, wow, this store has really bad connectivity. So the screens don't update as fast as we thought they would all of a sudden. And none of our test stores experience that. What do we do? And so that's the kind of thing that you have to get more engagement out of the right IT teams that handle that sort of infrastructure and scalability to know. And maybe it's just one meeting that happens, right, for the project team, where that group of people will ask 5 questions that are going to completely throw off the project team and say, oh, we didn't think of that. Now we need to go back and talk to the vendor to understand how this is going to work. And I've seen that happen many times. So those aren't insurmountable challenges, but it requires more planning. And if we're trying to do these things quickly and we're trying to do them at a faster speed, then it means, again, you've got to bring in the right people from all these different departments into a project. Now there are extremes. I mean, I won't name the retailer, but my favorite extreme example is one particular retailer in the U.S. who they were trying to launch a new store-in-a-store concept with a new brand, and it actually required over 70 departments to be involved in that project. And I'm not exaggerating; it was 70 departments. So you can imagine, the impact to the company culture. You can imagine the and somewhat sense of chaos initially of how are they going to manage this. So granted, it took them a while, but the net lesson they learned is it helped them understand how can they break down those barriers in the future once they did this, right? So that the next time it doesn't have to be 70 departments. It just needs to be the right set of people to get it right the first time. So that's kind of a key factor there.
I guess one of the things that are very, very interesting for us to hear from you exactly is your, view of those technologies that we sort of mentioned, because endless aisle, digital signage, and I don't know, curbside pickup. All of those technologies, where a lot of companies are listening about this and reading about this, and I know a lot of examples where they try to implement from a very simple version of the endless aisle up to a very upscale version of the endless aisle, where the company said, okay, we will eliminate all of the physical product from the brick and mortar store. We will only leave the, this touch screens, and we will give the clients an opportunity to buy on their own. I know a couple of companies here in Russia that have absolutely went bankrupt after a couple of years of trying to do so. What is your take on those technologies? Do you think that they will not fly on their own? Do they fly in some sort of a combination? Is it even worth it to concentrate on them and to invest your time and money in those technologies?
Yeah, I think that the thing to consider, particularly with technologies like endless aisle, and maybe we can put digital signage in general right into that category, but there are others. It varies by product category that you sell. It varies by which segment you are in the industries. What are you selling, right? It's am I a home goods store? Am I an apparel store? Am I is my customer a budget conscious customer, or am I selling luxury goods to high end clients? All of those factors kind of have a play here. So what works for one is not necessarily going to work for the other. So let's take an endless aisle, because I think you had a good example there. Just because you have the endless aisle capability doesn't mean that you should take all the products away and make them 100% digital in that physical environment. Now, let's say, especially if you're a general merchandiser, right? Because things, if you're selling essential goods and relatively commoditized products, right, and CPG products, right, most customers expect to be able to just pick it up off a shelf and leave the store with it, right? They're not expecting to say, I've got to go through this ordering process when I came to a store, right? If I'm going to go through an ordering process, I would have either done it from my phone or done it at home. I wouldn't have come here, right? I came because I want to see something, I want to touch something. But again, that is going to depend on the product. So you could, for example, be a luxury apparel brand, and maybe you just don't keep inventory in the store, but you have samples of everything. And then what's the purpose of the endless aisle? Then, well, it might be a matter of, selecting a different size or a different color or pattern in the particular piece of merchandise, where I might see one version of it in the store. I like it, but it has blue in it, and I don't like blue. I want red, but I can go to the screen and I can order the red, and it shows up, at my home the next day, for example. Those are legitimate use cases, I think, for that. But if I'm just going to the store and all I'm trying to buy are, paper clips, right? Or something really mundane, right? Then that just doesn't make any sense at all to force that to happen. So it really does depend on what kind of retailer are you, who are you serving, what's that customer expectation when they get to the physical location. So those are factors that I think are more important than just recognizing I want to use this technology. Now, other things like curbside pickup, this varies by country around the world, but if I'm going to generalize, I would say, things like curbside pickup have just inherently become much more popular because of the pandemic. And for example, I don't expect that popularity is going to go away. In some product categories, in some segments, you see less curbside pickup. So you start to see a decline. If you look at percentage of sales that use curbside pickup in some product segments, it has started to go down in some parts of the world, but then other categories are staying the same. So consumers are building new habits in how they shop for these things. Most people like to talk a lot about how this is impacting the grocery sector. Particularly around curbside pickup and delivery for grocery and digital ordering, which used to be negligible in most parts of the world. But now in many parts, it's becoming significant, and grocers are realizing that the cost of implementing that is not at all what they thought it would be, and it's really impacting their margins. So they have to come up with some way to adjust or implement differently to modify that cost model. But that's one segment. That doesn't mean that if that's the case in grocery, well, if I'm selling electronics, then the cost model is probably very different. And it might be okay. There are plenty of electronics categories where people don't care if they see it or not up front. They just know it's what they want and they want to order it. So curbside pickup then gives an appeal of immediacy and convenience, that I can get it now versus having to wait even 1 or 2 or more days for it to arrive at my home. So every retailer has to look at what's the right mix for the customers I'm serving. If I introduce one of these new things, is that going to bring in a new type of customer that I otherwise wasn't getting? Because they're more inclined to gravitate to that technology. And again, am I serving a budget-conscious customer or a luxury customer? A luxury apparel store might be inclined to implement intelligent mirrors in fitting rooms, right, that are digital in nature, that allow customers to do things beyond just look in the mirror at how it looks on them, right, when they go into a fitting room. And that may make sense for certain luxury brands. But if you're a discount apparel brand, does it really make sense to invest in that technology for the customers coming into your store? I would say probably not. You're probably putting something very expensive in the store that most of your customers are not going to use. So what was the advantage, right? Well, there was no real benefit there. It's not going to impact your conversion. It's not going to impact anything else that you're trying to measure. So that's how I think retailers need to look at these things. It kind of goes back to the earlier comment that technology for the sake of technology is not going to solve any business problems for you. It may introduce some, but it's not going to solve any unless you very purposefully implemented that technology for a reason.
So, given the fact that the consumers' habits have changed and we are entering the new year, what technologies do you see actually feeding to this new habits of the consumers, and some top technologies for the 2022 to look at and be conscious of for the retailers?
Yeah, I think there's a handful of trends. So one that I think is gaining a lot of popularity and discussion is social commerce and live streaming. It's generally getting a lot of interest because you can't pick up, I think, any kind of article about retail that doesn't talk about how significant this trend is in China and other parts of Asia. But there's a big question mark. A lot of people are asking, and particularly in Western countries, is it going to be as popular? My belief is that it is going to rise in popularity. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's going to get to the same level as you might see in China, because I think consumers are different across the world in different countries. But where I do see this having an impact, particularly with smaller retailers, because it gives smaller retailers expanded reach for what they're selling. They can reach more customers. They can reach them with less friction, particularly with younger demographics that are already inclined to want to shop this way. So for those retailers, I think there's a definite trend that we're going to see a lot more of this. Now, that's not to say that larger brands and larger retailers are going to ignore this. I've seen data from brands like Estee Lauder that did some live streaming success over summer months, and they increased their digital sales by 50% by doing this kind of live streaming tactic. So it absolutely works. I would claim that it's a proven method to sell. It's a matter of, again, is your customer the right customer to engage that way? Or are you trying to reach a new customer? So you have to answer those things up front. But I think that that's a trend we're going to see a lot more of this year. Another trend I think we're going to see is more technology for frontline staff in stores. I think for many years, there have been trends, especially at trade shows and things, particularly from vendors selling that technology, saying that, this is the year that retailers are going to heavily invest in their frontline staff. Well, unfortunately, none of those things ever happened by and large. I mean, there were small investments, but training was usually an afterthought. The technology for store associates was an afterthought. But now again, because of COVID, I think this has really surfaced how important enabling that frontline staff to be successful really is. And technology definitely has a role to play there, but there are right ways and wrong ways to do it. I believe that this year we're going to see an increase in investment in that technology because there's so much more attention being placed on the quality of work environment for that frontline staff. And because most retailers, I think, can't just infinitely increase wages to create a more pleasant experience for that workforce, they need to leverage other things. And one area they can leverage is technology to make it easier to do the less interesting tasks, for example. So there are lots of tools coming out, particularly ones that use AI and machine learning to help make repetitive tasks better. There are things around automation that can be done. And although you'll hear a lot of people be a little fearful of automation in the store because they feel that's going to take jobs away, my counterpoint to that is we're in a mode right now where the jobs can't be filled. So I would worry less about the jobs going away and rather view that the automation is a lever that retailers can use to enhance the work environment for the people they do have and the ones that they are hiring, so that the less interesting aspects of the job can maybe be reduced because of automation technology. And the more interesting ones, things like associate-led live streaming, for example. I think you'll see retailers hiring staff who are really good at live streaming, and really good is measured in terms of how they increase sales. Not every store associate is going to be good at that, right? Some are going to be better at fulfilling that curbside pickup order and doing the fulfillment in the back room, right? That's okay. It's okay to have these skills and tasks segmented to different parts of the staff, but that's where technology can come in to help you accomplish that. So I think we'll see more investment there. I think another trend I expect to see more of is low code and no code software technologies. And I say that because going back to what we talked about, the speed and agility and the need to be quick at deploying new technology, well, the best way you're going to do that is by leveraging low code technologies rather than more legacy development technologies that, requires a developer team to spend 6 months coding, right? We want to put the capability to create new business tools in the hands of non-developers, essentially, right? But the tools have to be good enough in a sense that you're not going to get, garbage in, garbage out type of scenario. You want to get productive tools. So the low code and no code tools that are available now are dramatically better than what we've seen in the past. There's been a rising trend in tools being deployed by retailers based on those technologies. I think that's going to significantly increase this year. And then I think one last trend I see is in retail media networks. This might be something that maybe is more for the larger retailers. Lots of people talk about Amazon and the really big e-commerce marketplaces and how much ad revenue they're generating. I believe the motivator for this for other retailers is not so much trying to steal some of that ad revenue from the Amazons of the world, because at the end of the day, you're not really stealing it from other e-commerce providers. You're stealing it from other advertising media outlets like TV, print and those places. But the real reason I think retailers are going to gravitate to this is the fresh customer data that's going to generate for them as they understand how their customers are shopping online with them because of how they engage with these ad units. And the need for more of that data, particularly as cookies start to go away, is going to be more and more important for retailers. So I think we'll see more and more of these retail media networks being done simply for the purpose of getting more customer data that I can then derive better insights about who my customers are and how to make them more loyal to the brand.
Well, that's very interesting. And if you can specify a little bit about the low code and no code technology, what is it about in a nutshell for the listeners who don't know this?
Sure. So what low code and no code technologies are, they're basically software development tools that are not so much designed for the traditional software developer, but they're really designed for the business user, where typically with a very visual look and feel in a design window, you can drag and drop components together so that if I have a data input, I apply some logic to it, then I can define in a very visual way, and I get a new output. Oftentimes, this is done for reporting tools. That's probably the most common, or building KPI dashboards so that maybe a district manager can quickly see how different stores are performing. Or an e-commerce director wants to understand what's today's conversion rate look like. We made changes to product pages. I want to analyze A/B test data. I can use low-code tools to very quickly put together complex reporting that otherwise I'd have to go to an IT development team and say, here's the kind of report I want. How long will it take you to produce that? And in the past, those IT folks would say, well, I probably need about 3 weeks to put that reporting code together. Well, now the business user with a low-code tool can probably build that report in 20 minutes and be ready to go. So that's really the significance of these low-code technology. It empowers the business users at the retailer to build their own tools without having to wait for IT staff to build things for them. And at the same time, for those IT guys, by the way, it also makes it easier for them too. So that same 3 weeks that they would have taken, they can do that same project in 20 minutes to whatever, or an hour, whatever it is, and give it back to the business user. So it works on both sides.
Sure. I'm sure that this actually gives a lot of scarcity to the IT guys. Maybe this is like the first time in the history when there is a scarcity, or
it could be. Like a fear of. I think if I'd expect most IT people to kind of see the silver lining here that says, you know what, at the same time, this technology is going to make their life a lot easier, and they're in turn going to be able to be more productive and produce more tools for the business than they used to. And that's going to make them inherently more valuable.
I guess that this same approach could be used in the CRM systems,
right.
in the CMS systems,
right.
like the website. So we already see that all of the newer CMS systems are very, very friendly, user-friendly, drag and drop solutions. So yeah, that's very interesting. So you think that in the future, the business would be much more compact. You mentioned one of the companies having 70 departments, and I guess those 70 departments has hundreds of people working for each department. And you think that it might be more, so it might be more and more compact in terms of how many people you need to actually get to those jobs done?
I think it depends on size and scale of the retailer's business. So, clearly that example I gave, that's a multi-billion-dollar retailer that I was talking about. So that's going to be a very different organization than a $100 million retailer or a $1 million retailer, right? So I think where you really see this as a factor is how quickly a retailer will be able to scale their organization. Of course, this assumes that they can hire the right people, right? We talked about the labor shortage and the skill set. So I think at the end of the day, the implication here is it's a new set of skills, and there's training to be had, there's skill development to be had. I think that the positive here is that it makes that retail business look more like a career path for the workforce, where I think at this point retailers have to be thinking about, where am I going to find the younger workforce that's going to come into my organization and stay with the company, right? How are they going to develop? How do I get those fresh ideas into my business, and not assume that I'm always going to rely on the staff I have? So, does it mean that they can have less staff? I'm not so sure I would necessarily say that. I think for the largest retailers that have those 70 departments, there's some reskilling that's going to happen. And that's probably a good thing. So for example, I find one big challenge retailers have is hiring enough data science oriented staff that can really dig into data analytics and help them. And why is that? Well, it's because every industry wants those people, right, with those skills. And what happens is you're as a retailer, you're competing with, for example, banks, right? You're competing with healthcare industry, who are hiring those same people, and oftentimes, right, those other industries are willing to pay more for those employees than retailers are. So retailers need to find, if they can't, afford the compensation, they've got to find other ways to entice those people to come work for them. So I think there's definitely a reskilling that's going to happen. So those organizations that have all of these silos and all of these huge departments with lots of staff, they're going to find new things for these employees to do. Now, some of those employers are likely to say, I'm kind of tired of this job, I want to go do something else. Maybe they go to another retailer, maybe they switch industries. There's going to be a lot of movement. I think this is a general issue that we're all going to be witnessing right across industries, and how the workforce in general moves around. So I think retailers have to just be aware of this and not assume that they don't have to do anything, right? They're going to have to be active in how they address this.
I just had a thought that we might be in a golden era of HR, because these are the days when everything looks very sophisticated to the people who are outside of the industry, and especially IT industry. But everything becoming low code, no code, makes hard skills less and less popular, and the soft skills, thinking outside of the box, actually finding the solution, more and more important for the job to do. So I guess that the generations to come will face new challenges, the
Right.
agility and the how fast they would need to learn new skills, basically,
Hmm.
not the hard skills, not the coding, but actually the soft skills of solving the problems. That's
Right.
very
Yeah. No, I
interesting.
absolutely think so. Yeah.
Cool. Ricardo, thank you very much for the information you shared with us. I'm sure that it was very, very interesting in the beginning of the year when the companies already have their strategy and already starting to implement everything. So this wisdom might be very, very useful for them to actually put a perspective on how they're planning to work during this year.
No, thanks, Philip. I appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much. We'll keep in touch, and bye bye.